The best confutation of the scheme of the Donatists is allowed to be the 6 books of Optatus, Bishop of Melvi. This work may be considered as the most authentic representation of the judgment of the Fathers and of their way of reasoning against the Donatists. He wrote towards the end of the 4th century. If the Fathers had considered the separation of the Donatists from the African Church as, in itself, a separation from the Catholic Church, Optatus would have insisted on this as a principal argument against that sect. How little he rested on this argument we may understand from the account which Dupin gives of that work. The first book, according to him, contains the history of the rise of the Donatist party and justifies secession. In the third book, Optatus vindicates the Catholics from the charge of having caused violence to be used against the Donatists. In the fourth book, he refutes this opinion of the Donatists that the ordinances of the Catholics were to be shunned on account of the personal sins of those who were admitted to partake in them. In the fifth book, he proves that the Donatists were criminal in reiterating baptism. In the sixth, he exposes the impieties and sacrileges of the Donatists. It is only in the second book that he argues against them on account of their separation from the Church. And here, the principal point which he proves against the Donatists is that their party was not the Catholic Church. This he proves, according to Dupin, from the extent of the Catholic Church and from their want of union with the chair of St. Peter, an argument which can have no weight with any but papists who hold the Church of Rome to be synonymous with the Catholic Church. Dupin does not say that Optatus asserts in any part of his work that the Donatists did not belong to the Catholic Church. With regard to Lucifer, the friend of Athanasius and the zealous opposer of compliance with the Arians, it is probable that he has been unjustly stigmatized. Perhaps justice is done the Luciferians by 2 late writers, Milner and Hawes. The one says that if the Luciferians imbibed the spirit of Lucifer, they must have been firm and sincere in the love of the truth. And the other reckons the Luciferians among the purer party. I have said so much on the subject of the Novatians and the Donatists because it has been long the favorite commonplace of time-servers in their invectives against any whose honesty and love of the truth led them to decline sacramental communion with the most numerous and fashionable party on account of their avowed obstinacy and their errors and corruptions. It is a topic that has been much used by the Papists against the Protestants, by the Episcopalians in England, against the Nonconformists, by those who defend or palliate the defections of the established Church of Scotland against the seceders, and now by the advocates for the latitudinarian scheme, which is so much the idol of the present day, against all who dare open a mouth in defense of such a church communion as is necessary for the maintaining of a faithful public profession of the truths and ordinances of Christ. It is also of importance to know that though the degeneracy of the Church was begun in the time of the Novatians, and was much farther advanced in the time of the Donatists, yet the Fathers had not then become so indifferent to the profession of the truth which they had attained as they were supposed to have been by those who plead for this lax scheme of church communion. Even then, there were footsteps of the flock which we ought to follow. With regard, however, to the present question, it might have been sufficient to observe that the communion which the Novatians and Donatists opposed in the ancient Church was no example of the communion which is now contended for. It was not a sacramental communion with the avowed and obstinate enemies of any one article of the Church's scriptural profession. It cannot be pretended that the lapsed who had become penitent, nor Cecilian, nor any of the churches with which they had communion were such. Nor did the Novatians or Donatists charge the Catholics with having sacramental communion with such enemies. The charges of these schismatics, as we have seen, were of a very different nature. They did not respect the public profession of persons admitted to sacramental communion, but their gracious state and their real saintship. With regard to the obligations of Christians to adhere to the communion of a particular church, to that, for example, of Rome or of Africa, Vitringa, in the 6th book of his Observations Sacrae, thinks that Augustine ought to have stated that obligation on Christians as not absolute, but hypothetical. That is, on condition that the church of which they were members shall continue in the profession of the truth, and, in his judgment, Augustine's doctrine, as it led men to account the obligation they were under to adhere to the communion of the Roman Church absolute, was a means of advancing the man of sin to his throne and of his establishment in it. From the view we have taken of the case of the Novatians and Donatists, it is indeed evident that there are some expressions in the passages you recite from Cyprian and Augustine which must be taken cum grano salis, or with some limitation, to make these fathers consistent with themselves and with the truth. Alex. The primitive church did not consider a variety of opinion and practice with respect to the modifications of her external order as inconsistent with her duty, or with her unity, It appears that the form of church government gradually altered so as to become, in process of time, very different from the apostolic establishment. Different opinions prevailed concerning her original order. In the 4th century, when episcopacy prevailed, contrary sentiments were maintained by Jerome, Arius, and others, with great acceptance among good people. Yet all this variety of opinion and practice in the matter of church order did not produce, and therefore was not thought sufficient to warrant separate communions. Jerome, Arius, and their adherents, who openly attacked the episcopacy of their day as destitute of scriptural or apostolic sanction, did not withdraw on that account from the fellowship of the Catholic Church and set up, like the Novatians and Donatists, a church of their own. Nor was there any rent in the ancient church on the account of different views and practices with regard to her government. Rufus. There seems to have been no great difference of opinion among the fathers concerning church government, if the statements of some who were good judges and much conversant with the ancient writers are to be regarded. With respect to the period of the first 3 centuries of the Christian Church, Jerome's testimony is sufficient, where he asserts that among the ancients, presbyters and bishops were the same. Augustine says that there is no difference of divine right between a bishop and a presbyter. Jewell against Harding alleges that the same thing is asserted by Chrysostom, Jerome, Ambrose, Theodoret, Sedulius, Theophylact, and Arius seems to have asserted not only that there was no difference of divine right between a bishop and a presbyter, but also that in his time there was not an ecclesiastical difference between them introduced as yet by any ecclesiastical law. In ordination, said Arius, the bishop lays his hands on the head of the person ordained, so does the presbyter. In the government of the church, the bishop sits in the throne of judgment, so does the presbyter. And this opinion of Arius Epiphanius, his opponent, could not and did not deny. And no doubt the writings of Arius, if they were extant, would have given us a fuller enumeration of those things which, in his time, were common to bishops and presbyters, even by ecclesiastical law, and would have shown how the bishops aspired to far greater power than either the divine or ecclesiastical law allowed them. Many ancient churches were governed by the presbyters without a diocesan bishop. The ministers of the African church in the 5th century, though called bishops, were so numerous that their charges could not be more extensive than those of the Presbyterian ministers of our day. Thorndike, a minister of the Church of England, acknowledges that the bishops in Africa were so plentiful that every good village must needs have been the seat of an episcopal church. In Augustine's time, says Bishop Burnet, there were about 500 bishoprics in a small tract of ground. These could be no more than pastoral charges. In Ireland, Clarkson shows by quotations from Bernard and Baronius that there were nearly as many bishops as churches or houses appropriated to public worship. Palladius was the first diocesan bishop in Scotland, according to an account of Prosper annexed to Eubius's Chronicle. Before him, says Jonas Major, the Scots were instructed in the faith by priests and monks without bishops. Thus, among many of the fathers and in the churches of Africa, Scotland, and Ireland, there seems to have been no variety of opinion or practice as to church government before the year 430, when Palladius was sent into Scotland. Farther, it appears that the witnesses for divine right of parity among all the ministers of the word and sacraments, and against the superiority of the office of a bishop to that of other ministers, began in the 4th or 5th century to maintain their cause in the way of separation, while the anti-Christian apostasy was hastening to its height. On account of the episcopal government, praying for the dead, the observation of set fasts, and the like corruptions, It is probable, says Mr. Calderwood, that Arius made secession from the Roman Church. His principles, as Mr. Howes observes, roused an host of enemies. The reproach of his falling into Arianism, though often repeated, appears to be groundless. This imputation is supported by the authority of Epiphanius only, who is generally allowed to have been too credulous with respect to reports, and who was remarkably attached to the superstitious customs against which Arius bore an open and faithful testimony. It is much against the truth of this charge that no such thing is mentioned by the ecclesiastical historians Theodoret, Socrates, Evagrius, or Sozomen. The same testimony against diocesan episcopacy was afterwards maintained by the Waldenses and the Albigenses in a state of separation from the Roman Church. The Waldenses and those who succeeded them in the same profession of religion maintained that in the Church of Christ bishops and presbyters were one and the same, and the degrees in the ministry is the image of the beast described in the Revelation. Ramarius of Pisa, a papist and an enemy to these witnesses, who wrote about the year 1250, acknowledge that this sect was spread about everywhere throughout the world, and had been of a long duration, having, according to some, continued from the time of Pope Sylvester, or from the reign of Constantine, and according to others, from the days of the apostles. The same testimony was maintained by Wycliffe in England and his adherents. In Paul's time, said they, 2 orders of clergymen were thought enough for the church, that is, priests and deacons. The other degrees are inventions of imperious pride. They wholly rejected all human rights and new shadows or traditions. The same doctrine was held by John Huss and his followers. Annius Silvius, speaking of the Hussites, said, "One of the dogmas of this pestiferous sect, so the papists term these faithful witnesses, is that there is no difference in order among those who bear the priestly office." The Bohemians, in their Confession of Faith, declare that it is necessary for the Church to have pastors learned and exemplary in their conduct, as well to preach God's word as to administer the sacraments and watch over the sheep of Jesus Christ, together with the elders and deacons, according to the rules of good and holy discipline and the practice of the primitive Church. Here is a large body of witnesses who continued their testimony against prelacy from the 4th century to the period of the Reformation, in the way of declining sacramental communion with that corrupt body which arrogated to itself the name of the Catholic Church. What shall we think of the scheme which represents all these witnesses as casting themselves, by the fact of their separation, out of the true Catholic Church, out of which there is no hope for salvation? The truth is, all that these witnesses did in declaring against and withdrawing from the great majority of the visible Church in this period was no more than their duty. Had such men as Chrysostom, Augustine, Jerome, and others acted as faithfully in opposing prelacy and endeavoring to restore the scriptural form of church government and worship, they would have stood in the gap before the Lord to avert the tremendous judgments that were then coming on the visible church. On the other hand, the general corruption was encouraged, and the ascendancy of the papal hierarchy hastened by the sacramental communion of these good men with the avowed and ambitious promoters of that corruption.